Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The recycled air on ISC Valdris Station tasted, as it always did, faintly of burnt circuitry and the collective anxiety of 12 different species trying to get through breakfast without a diplomatic incident. Pell had been stationed here for 7 months, and in that time he had developed 2 reliable coping mechanisms. A very specific breathing technique his bunkmate had taught him, and the habit of checking, every single morning, whether Bunk Row 7 was occupied before he decided which route to take to the cafeteria. It was always occupied. He took the long route. Valdris Station existed at the frayed edge of Sector 9, orbiting a tidally locked moon that was geologically stable, strategically significant, and visually the most depressing thing Pell had ever seen out of a viewport. A gray landscape bisected by a permanent terminator line, one half in perpetual noon, the other in perpetual nothing. The station itself was a coalition installation, which meant it had been built by committee, renovated by a different committee, and was currently being argued about by a third committee that couldn't agree on whether the Eastern Wing's atmospheric processors were a maintenance issue or a philosophical one. It housed approximately 300 personnel across a range of species, ranks, and temperaments. Most of them got along reasonably well. Most of them had learned to navigate the particular social mathematics of multi-species cohabitation, the careful calibration of eye contact, the management of spatial thresholds, the unspoken agreements about which sections of the cafeteria belonged, informally but firmly, to whom. And then there was the Eastern Barracks, Bunk Row 7, and the reason Pell took the long route. Her name was in the station's personnel database as Kaelith Sorn, which told you her name and nothing else useful. What the database also contained, filed under a tab labeled Supplementary Notes in the cautious, bureaucratic font of someone who had chosen their words very carefully, was a list of incident reports, 17 of them, organized by date, each summarizing an event that had been resolved without fatalities but not without paperwork. Below the incident reports was a section labeled Approach Protocol, which read in its entirety, verbal announcement required at minimum 3 meters. Announce from the front. Do not announce from the side. Do not, under any circumstances, announce from behind. See Incident 7. Nobody had read Incident 7 twice. The Vahressi, as a species, looked almost human, which Pell had always found personally unsettling in the way that things that are almost right tend to be more disturbing than things that are entirely wrong. Kaelith Sorn had 2 legs, 2 arms, a face arranged in the standard configuration of eyes and a nose and a mouth. She had dark hair, cut short in a way that was purely functional. She stood at human height. If you saw her from across the station's observation deck, in low light, at a distance, you might not look twice. Then you looked once more and your nervous system quietly noted the corrections. The skin that shifted between deep bronze and cool silver depending on the light, and, more relevantly, her mood. The amber eyes with no visible pupil, which gave the impression that she was surveying everything simultaneously, and had already pre-categorized it all as potential threats and ranked them in descending order of concern. The fingers that were slightly too long, the teeth which were slightly too even in the way of something that evolution had decided to make very good at its job, and the quills. They ran from the base of her skull down her spine, retractable, faintly bioluminescent at their tips, and currently, as Pell observed from a distance that he had personally calculated and felt confident about, extended and lit in the particular, amber gold that the xenobiology briefing had described as heightened territorial awareness. She was eating alone at the far end of the cafeteria, which was, technically, a public space, and which had nevertheless become, through the accumulated social consensus of 300 beings who had all made their own independent decision, her space. The table nearest to her was empty. The next one, too. The geometry of the room arranged itself around her the way water arranges itself around a stone, not dramatically, Not obviously, just inevitably, with the smooth efficiency of a crowd that has learned something without having a meeting about it. She was eating something gray. Pell ate something slightly less gray at the maximum comfortable distance and tried not to stare. Across the table from him, Os, who had been on Valdris for 2 full years and claimed to be beyond surprise, was staring directly at the new orders that had just pushed through on both their data pads simultaneously. Os's 4 ears were cycling through positions that indicated, in sequence, confusion, disbelief, and the specific variety of second-hand sympathy one feels for a stranger walking toward something avoidable. Pell read the orders. He read them again. He looked at Os. "They're assigning her a human," Os said. "I can see that." "A liaison officer." "Yes, a human liaison officer." Pell looked back down at the orders, then across the cafeteria at Kaelith Sorn, who had finished her gray meal, stood up with the fluid, unhurried economy of movement that never quite looked like walking so much as controlled forward threat assessment, and left the room without looking at anyone. The space she vacated somehow remained empty for several minutes afterward, like the air itself was slow to trust that she was gone. "The file says he's calm under pressure," Pell offered. Os looked at him. "So is a collapsed star," Os said. "Doesn't mean I'd send it to introduce itself to Sorn." Pell closed his data pad, looked at the door through which Kaelith had disappeared, and said a small, quiet prayer for a man he had never met and whose name, according to the transfer orders, was Eli Voss, and who was, according to the same orders, arriving on Tuesday. Someone, Pell thought, should warn him. Someone, Pell also thought, should figure out what exactly you would say. Eli Voss arrived on a Tuesday, which was not a concept that Valdris Station officially recognized but which he continued to observe on principle, because someone had to. He came through the secondary docking bay with 1 regulation duffel bag, 1 thoroughly non-regulation thermos of coffee that had survived 2 transit jumps, a hyperspace relay checkpoint, and a security scan conducted by a Gorathi officer who had looked at the thermos for a long time, and then decided, wisely, that some battles were not worth the paperwork. He had read the briefing document on the 14-hour transit. He had read it twice. He had then folded it neatly, put it away, and spent the remaining hours of the journey reading a very long maintenance report about Valdris Station's Eastern Wing atmospheric processors, which turned out to be the more alarming document of the two. The docking officer who processed his transfer was a young Threnish with ears that cycled through 3 positions during the 30 seconds it took to confirm Eli's credentials, which Eli interpreted, correctly, as the local equivalent of a nervous habit. The officer's name tag read PELL. He handed Eli his station access chip and said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they had rehearsed, "Your quarters are in the Western Residential Block. The briefing with Operations Coordinator Goss is at 1400. The cafeteria hours are posted in your welcome packet." Then he paused. His ears moved. He said, "There's also a supplementary document in the packet. About your assignment. It has a section called Approach Protocol." "I read it," Eli said. Pell's ears stilled. He looked at Eli with the expression of someone who had expected a different reaction and was now recalibrating. "You read the incident reports. All 17. Another pause. "And you're still," Pell gestured vaguely at the station, at the future, at the general concept of what Eli was walking into. "I'm still here, yes," Eli said pleasantly. He picked up his bag. He thanked Pell with the sincere, uncomplicated warmth of someone who genuinely meant it, which was its own particular variety of disorienting, and walked off down the corridor. Pell watched him go. Then Pell sent a message to Os that read, "He read all the reports. He seems fine. I think something might be wrong with him." Goss received Eli in the operations office with the brisk efficiency of someone who had 3 other things to deal with and was choosing, by sheer force of administrative will, not to show it. Goss was a being of considerable organizational intelligence and very tired eyes. and had been running Valdris Station's personnel coordination for long enough that surprise had largely ceased to be a response they were capable of, or so Goss had believed, until they watched Eli read through Kaelith Sorn's complete file and ask, as his first question, whether her dietary supplements were being administered correctly. Because the gray ration blocks were technically sufficient, but he'd looked up Vahressi metabolic requirements on the transit, and there appeared to be a gap in the micronutrient profile. Goss looked at him. Eli asked his second question, which was whether Kaelith had been consulted about the liaison arrangement or simply informed of it. Goss continued to look at him. "Those are my two questions," Eli said. "We informed her," Goss said slowly, "that the arrangement had been approved." "Right," Eli said, in the tone of someone noting something down internally. "I'd like to meet her now if that's possible." The meeting was arranged in the Eastern Equipment Bay, which had been selected by Goss's team on the basis of 3 criteria. It was large, it had 4 exits, and it contained nothing whose destruction would constitute a significant operational loss. Kaelith was already there when Eli arrived, standing at a workbench with her combat kit laid out in front of her in the precise, organized arrangement of someone conducting maintenance with great attention, and absolutely no requirement for assistance. Her quills were extended. The bioluminescence at their tips ran amber, steady, the particular frequency that the xenobiology notes had flagged as active territorial calibration. Her amber eyes moved to the door the moment it opened, which is to say before it fully opened, because the motion sensor in the corridor outside had already told her what she needed to know. Eli walked in. He looked at her. He found a crate near the door, sat on it, and said, "You must be Sorn. I'm Voss. I've been assigned as your liaison, which I understand you weren't consulted about, and I want you to say so if that's a problem, because I think it's a fairly poor way to handle things, and I'd rather know where we actually stand than pretend we're starting from somewhere we're not." Kaelith said nothing. The quills pulsed once, an irregular rhythm that had no entry in the standard xenobiology reference tables, because no researcher had previously documented it outside of controlled conditions. She was looking at him with the full weight of a nervous system, designed to extract threat data from environmental stimuli, and currently finding almost none, which was itself a kind of data she didn't have a category for. "You're not afraid," she said. Eli considered this with genuine thoughtfulness rather than the reflexive denial she had learned to expect from beings trying to manage her. "I read the incident reports," he said. "Everyone who got hurt had either startled you, invaded your space, or was actively trying to establish dominance. I'm not planning on doing any of those things, so statistically I feel fairly comfortable." She looked at him for a moment. "That's an optimistic reading." "I'm an optimistic person," he said. He held out his thermos. "Do you want coffee? It's from the Kellen processing region, which I realize means nothing to you probably, but it's good." Kaelith looked at the thermos. She looked at Eli. The quills pulsed again, that same unclassifiable rhythm. She did not take the coffee, but she also didn't tell him to leave, which Goss, watching from the security feed in the operations room with both hands flat on the desk, exhaled it quietly and at length. Over the days that followed, something happened that the station had no operational framework for, and therefore dealt with by not acknowledging it directly. Eli did not manage Kaelith. He did not speak to her in the careful, over-enunciated register that everyone else had developed, the one she privately thought of as the "please remain calm" tone, the one that made her feel like a hazard warning. He talked to her the way he apparently talked to everyone, as though she were a person with opinions, which she was, and as though her opinions were worth hearing, which they were, and without the faint, persistent undercurrent of masked adrenaline that her nervous system had learned to read in every other being on the station like a signal she could not turn off. He noticed things without making them into conversations. Her supplements appeared in the correct order one morning without explanation. A corridor route she preferred because it passed fewer occupied rooms started appearing on their shared logistics schedules. When she told him once flatly that she didn't need supervision, he said, "I know, I don't think of it that way." And then he moved on because he genuinely didn't, and her nervous system, which was exquisitely calibrated to detect the difference between truth and performance, registered that fact at a level that had nothing to do with language. The quills didn't retract, but on the fourth evening in the equipment bay, when Eli said something dry and quiet about the maintenance scheduling report he was annotating, and she made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was structurally adjacent to one, they dimmed. Just briefly, just at the tips. But Pell, who was passing in the corridor, saw it through the transparent partition and stood very still for a moment before walking on quickly to go tell Os that something was either going very well or in a direction no one had planned for, and possibly both. It was Pell who noticed first, which was either a testament to his observational skills or evidence that he had developed an unhealthy level of investment in the behavioral patterns of a being who could dislocate his secondary shoulder joint without adjusting her stance. He noticed it on a Wednesday, another unit of time Valdris Station did not officially recognize, and which he had started using because Eli Voss used it and it had apparently become contagious. When he walked into the corridor outside the eastern equipment bay and saw Kaelith Sorn standing at the workbench with her back to the door and her quills, not fully extended, not retracted, somewhere between the two, in a state the xenobiology briefing had not given a name to, which meant either it was unimportant or no researcher had previously lived long enough to document it. He walked past without stopping, because stopping would have required a reason, and he didn't have one that he could explain without sounding like he was conducting unauthorized surveillance on a Tier 1 combatant, which he technically was. He found Os in the communications bay and described what he had seen in a low, careful voice, the way people describe something they aren't sure is real yet. Os said, "That could mean anything." Pell said, "It happened again yesterday. And the day before." Os was quiet for a moment. Then Os said, "We should not be keeping track of this." "I know," Pell said, "it's not our business." "I know. Kaelith Sorn is a Tier 1 independent combatant with 17 incident reports and an approach protocol." "I know." They looked at each other. Os pulled up a blank data log and dated it. "What exactly did you observe?" Os said, "and at what time?" What they were observing, though they didn't have the framework to understand it, was the early stages of something that Vahressi cultural literature described in terms so dense with biological subtext that the coalition's translation algorithms had spent years producing versions that were technically accurate and completely unintelligible. The closest approximation, according to a xenobiological paper that neither Pell nor Os had read, and which was available in the station's academic database under a filing category so obscure it might as well have been hidden, was this. When a Vahressi nervous system encounters a being who produces no threat signal, not a suppressed one, not a managed one, but a genuinely absent one, the threat assessment architecture that runs as their biological default begins, incrementally and against the organism's conscious resistance, to downshift. Not because the Vahressi decides to trust, because the machinery runs the numbers, and the numbers keep coming back clean, and eventually even the most sophisticated security system will, after enough consecutive negative results, begin to wonder if it is looking for something that isn't there. Kaelith was not wondering anything. She was, if asked, not doing anything at all. She was simply continuing to exist on Valdris Station in exactly the way she always had, eating alone and working alone, and running threat assessments on every corridor she passed through. And if she had also begun to take a specific route to the eastern equipment bay that happened to pass the communal rest area, where Eli Voss spent his evenings doing administrative work, that was a matter of operational efficiency and had nothing to do with anything else. She had noticed, with the precise internal awareness her species carried like a second nervous system, that her quills were behaving differently. She noticed it the way you notice a sound that has stopped, not in the moment of change, but in the sudden textural difference of its absence. They were not dimming often. They were not dimming significantly. But they were dimming, and they were doing it in one specific context, in one specific room, in proximity to one specific human who had, 3 days ago, looked up from his maintenance report and said, without preamble and with complete sincerity, that the Coalition's approach to cross-species housing assignments was genuinely poorly designed, and that whoever had decided Vahressi personnel didn't require territorial buffer zones in their bunk assignments had clearly never read the biology briefing, and had she ever formally filed on it because she should. She had looked at him. She had said she hadn't. He had said that was a waste and handed her a standard grievance form and gone back to his report. She had held the form for a moment. She had filed it the next morning. She had no framework for what to do with the fact that it was the first time in 3 years anyone on this station had suggested that the environment, rather than her response to it, might be the variable worth adjusting. The informal observation project that Pell and Oss were running, and which had, by the end of the second week, expanded to include a marine adjudicator named Thras who had wandered into the conversation by accident and been unable to leave, generated 17 entries before any of them felt confident enough to state a conclusion. The entries included observations like 1400 hours, cafeteria, subject entered and did not immediately recalibrate seating geometry of room. Standard dispersal pattern delayed by approximately 90 seconds, and 800 hours, corridor junction 4, subject passed within 2 meters of Ensign Voss without prior verbal announcement. No incident. Ensign Voss said good morning. Subject said something back. Could not hear from distance but was not a threat response, and most significantly, 1930 hours, communal rest area, subject entered space voluntarily. Sat in far corner, stayed for 40 minutes, left without incident. Quill luminescence, reduced. Thras read this last entry and said, reduced by how much? Pell and Oss looked at each other. We don't have a baseline, Oss admitted. We've only ever seen them fully extended. So anything less than fully extended is the baseline now, Thras said. Yes, but, Thras said carefully, there is a Vahressi cultural concept. I read about it years ago, peripherally, called Suvrath. It translates very roughly. The gist of it is a being in whose presence the threat assessment system ceases to find material. I don't know the biology behind it. I only know that in the literature it's considered extremely significant and apparently involuntary. The communications bay was quiet for a moment. Involuntary, Pell repeated. As in her nervous system is doing this, Oss said, and she may not have chosen it. As in, Thras said and paused, selecting words, she may not be able to stop it. Another silence. From somewhere down the corridor came the distant sound of Eli Voss's voice, talking to himself about something administrative, the mild continuous commentary of a person who processes out loud and has never found a reason to stop. And from the same direction, not visible but present, the soft sound of footsteps that paused, that did not move away. Pell looked at Oss. Oss looked at Thras. None of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already being said by the data log and the dimming quills and the footsteps standing in the corridor outside a room where a human was doing paperwork, not moving away, just standing there in the particular stillness of a being that has found something it doesn't have a word for yet, and is simply, quietly, staying close to it. The wellness check was Goss's fault in the way that all honest things are someone's fault, not through malice, but through the simple mechanism of doing the job correctly. The automated system flagged 2 missed meal registrations and an overdue equipment sign-out at 600, and Goss, operating on the institutional reflex of someone who had been filling out the same forms for long enough that they no longer required thought, sent the check request to Pell. Because Pell had demonstrated the most consistently intact survival instincts on the station, and because, Frankly, no one else had volunteered. Pell stood outside the communal rest area for a long time before he looked through the viewport. He looked through the viewport. He stood there for 8 full seconds without moving, which was long enough for his body to complete a threat assessment cycle, determine there was no immediate danger, and then arrive at the considerably more complicated question of what exactly he was supposed to do with what he was seeing. Eli Voss was asleep in his usual chair, with the specific structural abandon of a human being who had achieved complete unconsciousness, without any apparent concern for what his spine would say about it in the morning. One arm rested along the back of the seat. His expression was the empty, uncomplicated expression of someone whose nervous system had decided, without consultation, that everything was fine. And curled against him, with her head resting on his shoulder and one hand lying loosely across his forearm, was Kaelith Sorn. She was breathing. The rhythm of it was slow, slower than anything Pell's 7 months on Valdris Station had ever shown him from her, slower than the xenobiology briefing suggested was physiologically standard outside of Vahressi bonding conditions. And her quills, which Pell had to look at 3 separate times because his brain kept trying to issue a correction, were fully retracted, completely dark, the bioluminescence gone as though it had never existed, leaving only smooth skin at the base of her neck, and an expression on her sleeping face that Pell had no reference point for because it required a version of Kaelith Sorn he had never seen, a version that was simply, without armor or calculation, at rest. He sent the message to Os with hands that were not entirely steady. The message said, "Common room. Now, no noise, no running, trust me." Os arrived in 4 minutes. Os looked through the viewport. Os's ears did something that had no diplomatic translation. Os forwarded the message to Thras. Thras forwarded it to someone in engineering who had been peripherally involved in the data log. That person told 2 others. The process had the organic, unstoppable momentum of information that is too strange to keep to oneself. And within 16 minutes there were 11 beings standing in the corridor outside the communal rest area, arranged in a neat and extremely quiet row, each one taking a turn at the viewport, and then stepping back with the expression of someone who has just witnessed something that has rearranged a small but significant assumption they didn't know they were carrying. The logistical challenge, which no one had anticipated because no one had ever needed to anticipate it, was that they were all terrified of waking someone who was only dangerous when awake, and yet they could not leave, because leaving would require admitting that they had been standing in a corridor for 20 minutes conducting unauthorized emotional surveillance on a superior officer and her assigned liaison, and none of them had the paperwork for that. So they stayed. They communicated entirely in the silent, elaborate sign language of beings who have collectively decided that sound is the enemy, which meant the corridor outside the communal rest area looked, to the single maintenance drone that passed through at 700 and briefly scanned the assembly, like a group of senior personnel engaged in an extremely tense and gesture-heavy committee meeting with no chairs. Thras pulled up the xenobiology database on a data pad and found the passage about Suvrath and held it up. Os read it. Os passed it to Pell. Pell read it and then looked through the viewport again, at Kaelith's retracted quills and her slow breathing and the complete unconscious trust of a body that had spent 3 years in a state of biological red alert and had finally, without announcement, stood down. Pell had the distinct and slightly overwhelming feeling of watching something that mattered, though he could not have said precisely why it felt that way, only that it did, in the way that some true things make themselves known before you have the language for them. Eli woke on his own, which was fortunate, because none of them had devised a plan for the alternative. He surfaced the way he did everything, without drama, without a transition period, just suddenly present and oriented. He registered the viewport. He registered the 11 faces arranged in a row on the other side of it, all aimed in his direction, with expressions ranging from astonished to deeply moved to the particular look of a marine adjudicator, who was trying very hard to appear as though they had a legitimate reason to be here. He looked at Kaelith, still asleep against his shoulder. He looked back at the viewport. He raised one finger to his lips. The corridor held its collective breath. Then he smiled, small and private and not for any of them, and that was somehow worse in terms of emotional impact than anything that had preceded it. Kaelith woke 12 minutes later, the way her species woke, between one moment and the next with no intermediate state, and for a fraction of a second before her conscious architecture fully engaged, she simply existed in the warmth and the stillness without reaching for the threat assessment. It was the smallest moment. It lasted less than a second, but it was the first time in 3 years that her nervous system had not reached first, and she registered it the way you register something missing that you had stopped expecting to find. Then she was fully awake and she straightened, and she ran a hand over her quills with the focused composure of someone confirming data, and the quills were still retracted and she looked at Eli. Eli said, "Good morning." Kaelith looked at him for a moment. Through the viewport, 11 beings held the collective breath of a station that had been watching something grow in the margins of its daily operations, and had only now, this morning, understood what it was. She said, "Don't make it strange." "I wasn't planning to," Eli said. She stood. She straightened her uniform. She moved toward the door with the same precision that she moved everywhere, the same controlled economy that had made 17 incident reports possible, except that when she reached the door she stopped and without turning said, in a tone calibrated to carry exactly as far as the room and no further, "The grievance form, about the housing assignments." A pause. "Command approved the amendment this morning. Territorial buffer zones are now standard in the intake protocol." Eli said, "I saw, you should have filed it 2 years ago." "Yes," she said, and there was something in the word that contained more than the word, and she left. The corridor dissolved in the way that crowds dissolve when each individual member suddenly becomes very interested in being somewhere else. And within 90 seconds the only ones remaining were Pell, Os, Thras, and Gauss, who had arrived in the final minutes and had stood at the back of the assembly, reading the xenobiology passage 3 times with the expression of someone doing the math and finding that it adds up. Gauss called through the partially open door, quietly, and Eli filled in the remaining pieces in the unhurried way of someone recounting something that happened to them rather than something they engineered. She had appeared during his rest period 3 nights ago, stood across the room for 20 minutes, moved closer by degrees, asked in the smallest voice he had heard from her whether he minded her proximity, and he had said no because he didn't, and she had sat beside him and been asleep within 10 minutes, and he hadn't moved, because waking her had seemed like the cruelest possible response to something that had taken that much effort to ask. Gauss looked at him for a long time. Gauss looked at the xenobiology passage on Thras's data pad. Gauss said, with the exhausted sincerity of someone who has spent 3 years managing a situation and is only now understanding what the situation actually was, "You didn't do anything." "I was just there," Eli said. "That was enough," Gauss said, and it came out sounding less like an operational assessment than something else, and Gauss cleared their throat and closed the door and walked away down the corridor because there was paperwork to file, and there was always paperwork to file, and some feelings were easier carried in motion. In the eastern equipment bay, at Bunk Row 7, the partition that had separated Kaelith's space from the rest of the barracks had been moved 3 centimeters overnight. Not enough for anyone to notice, not enough to invite comment, just enough to mean something. Her supplement pack sat on the bench in the correct order. Her data pad had, in the last hour, a single new document open, not a mission brief, not a tactical analysis, but a request she had pulled from the station's internal directory and apparently read all the way through and not yet decided whether to send. It was a transfer request for the liaison arrangement, not a termination, a permanent reassignment. The form required 2 signatures, and the second line was blank, and she had not filled it in yet, which meant she was still thinking, and Kaelith Sorn thinking something through was, in the experience of everyone who had ever known her, the most dangerous and promising thing in any room she occupied. She thought it through until 9:30. Then she filled in the second line. Then she sent it before she could decide not to, with the precise and irreversible motion of someone who has been holding tension for a very long time and has finally, in one quiet and deliberate act, chosen to let it go.